The boy was never seen after the field trip in 1999. Then his camera was found in a thrift store. A disposable camera, still sealed in its original cardboard sleeve, was found tucked beneath a pile of mismatched linens in a thrift store. 25 years after 12-year-old Ethan Miller vanished during a field trip to the Washington Monument, his image fading from newspapers to milk cartons to the mournful archives of the missing. No one had expected to find anything of his, not after all this time, not like this, pristine and untouched as if waiting, a tiny capsule of a lost day. The woman who bought it for $1, a solitary figure named Clara who drifted through such forgotten places seeking echoes of other lives, drawn by its anachronistic presence amongst chipped porcelain and threadbare coats, felt the first prickle of deep, unnameable unease only when she decided, on a whim born of a gray Tuesday afternoon, to break the decades-old seal and develop the film inside, a small act of curiosity that would unravel a silence carefully, cruelly, kept for a quarter of a century. The cardboard, brittle with age yet surprisingly intact, tore with a small, dry sound, releasing a faint, plasticky scent of the late 90s. Inside, the camera itself, a cheerful yellow and red, felt impossibly light, almost a toy, yet it contained a weight she could not yet comprehend. The film advance wheel turned with a satisfying click, the counter stubbornly stuck on S before finally, with gentle persuasion, nudging to 1:27 exposures. A ghost roll. The journey to the pharmacy's photo kiosk felt like a descent, each step heavier than the last. Why this compulsion? She didn't know Ethan Miller, had only a vague recollection of such cases that flare briefly in the national consciousness before sinking under the tide of new tragedies. Yet the camera felt personal, a direct line to a moment stolen. The hour of waiting for the development stretched into an eternity, the mundane surroundings of the pharmacy, the bright aisles of cough syrup and greeting cards, a jarring contrast to the burgeoning dread in her chest. When the attendant, a young man with indifferent eyes, handed her the thin paper envelope, it felt cold to the touch. She didn't open it there, under the fluorescent hum. She took it back to her small, quiet apartment, the silence amplifying the crinkle of the paper. The first photograph slid out, a slightly tilted, sun-blasted shot of the Washington Monument, its white stone piercing a pale, cloudless sky. An ordinary tourist photo, the kind a child would take, eager and impatient. Then came the others, a procession of fleeting moments, two boys with arms slung around each other, squinting into the sun, their faces alight with ephemeral joy. A blurry shot of a teacher's sensible shoes on the grass, a half-eaten apple core resting on a textbook titled American History, pigeons taking flight in a panicked flurry. Their wings a gray smudge against the green of the mall. Each image was a small, sharp pang, a window into a day that had begun with such promise and ended in an abyss of unknowing. She spread them across her worn wooden table, these fragments of a life interrupted, the colors strangely vivid, preserved by their long sleep in the dark, and then she reached the last one. Photo 27. It was utterly different from the sunlit innocence of the preceding images. The flash had fired, stark and brutal, illuminating a claustrophobic scene. Dense, waxy leaves, sharply defined, pressed close to the lens, creating a tunnel of green. And through that tunnel, from the deeper shadows beyond the flash's reach, two eyes stared back. Wide, pale, unblinking, not animal, human, they were fixed, not on the camera itself, but seemingly on whoever held it, or perhaps on something just beyond. But it was the reflection, the ghost in the machine, caught in the subtle curve of the unseen lens belonging to those watching eyes, that made Clara's breath catch in her throat, a strangled, silent gasp. There, miniaturized, distorted yet horribly clear, was a face. A young boy's face, mouth open in a silent O of terror, eyes wide with a knowledge no child should possess. It was Ethan Miller. His red baseball cap, the one described in all the old reports, was askew on his dark hair. The reflection was small, a tiny detail in a larger, more sinister picture, but it was undeniably him. The boy who vanished, captured in the lens of his own killer, his abductor. The receipt from the pharmacy, almost an afterthought, lay beside the chilling photograph. She picked it up, her fingers trembling. Printed in small, pixelated text at the bottom, beside the date and time of her own transaction, were 2 words: film processed. And then a date, not from 1999, but from the previous month, May 17, 2024. The film, dormant for 25 years, had been developed only weeks ago. Someone else had possessed this camera recently. Someone else had seen these images, had seen Ethan's terror, had seen the eyes in the foliage, and then, for reasons unknown, had let the camera, this silent, damning witness, slip into the anonymous flow of discarded things, into a thrift store, into her hands. The room seemed to tilt, the ordinary objects on her shelves receding into shadow as the implications crashed down upon her. This wasn't just an echo of the past, it was a live wire, still humming with a terrible, present energy. The eyes in the leaves, they were not just a memory. They belonged to someone who had walked free for 2.5 decades, someone who had developed this film, and someone who might still be out there, watching. The weight of the small plastic camera now felt immense, a cold, heavy stone in the pit of her stomach. The 26 photographs of a lost summer day were eclipsed entirely by the 27th, a single frame that screamed a truth someone had tried, and failed, to keep buried forever. Clara found herself unable to sleep. The image of the eyes, those pale, knowing discs in the dark green, seared onto the inside of her eyelids. Each time she closed them, the reflection of Ethan's terrified face swam into view, a silent accusation. The silence of her apartment, usually a comfort, now felt charged, as if the watcher from the photograph might materialize in the shadows of her own home. Who was Ethan Miller? The name, once a headline, had faded into the collective subconscious, another sorrowful statistic. She rose before dawn, the city still a muted blue outside her window, and went to her computer, the glow of the screen illuminating her drawn face. Ethan Miller. Born March 3rd, 1987. Disappeared April 2020, 1999. Washington, D.C. A class trip to the National Mall, a celebration of spring, of history, of youthful promise. He had been with his best friend, Michael, near the base of the monument. They were taking pictures, laughing. Michael had turned to tie his shoe, a matter of seconds, and when he looked up, Ethan was gone. Vanished into the midday crowds, into the vast, open space, as if the earth itself had swallowed him. No witnesses saw anything suspicious. No demands were ever made. The search had been frantic, then desperate, then, finally, heartbreakingly resigned. His parents, David and Susan Miller, their faces etched with a grief that aged them decades in mere months, had pleaded on television, their voices raw with an agony that Clara, even now, 25 years later, felt as a visceral punch. David, a quiet man, an engineer, had systematically mapped every inch of the mall, every possible route Ethan could have taken, his hope a dwindling candle against an encroaching storm of despair. Susan, a teacher herself, had clung to the belief that one of her son's classmates, perhaps even a chaperone, must have seen something, anything. She had re-interviewed them herself, gently, persistently, until the school authorities had asked her to stop, the children too distressed by the constant reminder of their lost friend. The news archives painted a grim tapestry, aerial shots of search teams, divers in the reflecting pool, the solemn faces of FBI agents. There were theories, of course. A random abduction, a fall into an unseen maintenance shaft, a sudden, inexplicable decision to run away, though nothing in Ethan's happy, stable life suggested the latter. He was a good student, loved baseball, collected stamps, and was saving up for a telescope. He had been excited about the trip, about using the new disposable camera his grandfather had given him for his 12th birthday just weeks before. That camera. The detail leapt out at Clara from a faded newspaper clipping she found online, a quote from his tearful mother. He loved that camera. He promised to take pictures of everything. The camera now sat on Clara's table, a malevolent relic. The police had, naturally, asked about it back then. Had anyone seen Ethan with it? Had he dropped it? No, it was presumed lost with him, another piece of the puzzle that would never be found. Until now. Clara felt a shiver trace its way down her spine. The camera wasn't just a clue. It was a direct link, a bridge across the chasm of years. The fact it was sealed when she found it suggested something profound. Had the watcher, the owner of those eyes, taken it from Ethan, kept it as a trophy, a secret, for all these years, only to recently, inexplicably, decide to have the film developed? And then, even more bizarrely, discarded, still sealed in its original packaging, as if it were nothing? Or had Ethan himself, in a desperate final act, somehow managed to seal it back up before what? The thought was too horrifying. The packaging was old, yes, but it could have been resealed, however crudely. Or perhaps the camera she found was not Ethan's original camera, but one bought later, the film swapped. But the images, the specific progression of a school trip, Ethan's classmates, the monument, they were too specific. No, this had to be his. The metadata was the true anomaly. May 17, 2024. Someone, somewhere, had recently looked upon these images. What had they felt? Triumph? Guilt? Fear? The logistics of the disappearance were baffling. The National Mall on a spring day was teeming with people. How could a child simply evaporate, unless he hadn't? Unless he'd been lured away, quietly, efficiently, by someone who knew how to navigate the periphery, the unseen spaces. The foliage in photo 27, it was dense, not the manicured lawns of the mall proper. It suggested a less public area, perhaps one of the bordering gardens, or a secluded spot near the tidal basin's edge. Clara printed out a map of the Washington Monument and its surrounding grounds, her finger tracing the pathways, the clusters of trees, the service roads. Where could those eyes have been hiding? And why would Ethan have pointed his camera there, unless he hadn't? Unless the camera had been taken from him and the final, terrible photo was taken by the watcher of Ethan. But the reflection in the lens, it showed Ethan holding something dark, small, like a camera, as if he were taking a picture of his pursuer, a final defiant act of witness. The thought sent a fresh wave of cold dread through Clara. This boy, this 12-year-old, might have documented his own end. The weight of this possibility pressed down on her. She was no detective, no crusader. She was just a woman who collected lost things. But this lost thing, it demanded more than just a place on her shelf. It demanded a voice. The eyes in the photo were a challenge, a silent taunt, and the recently developed film was a reckless mistake, an opening. A chance, however slim, to reclaim a story that had been violently silenced for far too long. She thought of Susan Miller, whose online photos showed a woman hollowed out by grief, her eyes holding a permanent shadow. What would this discovery do to her? Reopen a wound that had never truly healed, or offer a sliver of terrible, necessary truth? The responsibility felt crushing. But the image of Ethan's face, reflected in that dark lens, left her no choice. She had to find out who those eyes belonged to. The intervening years had been a slow erosion of hope for Ethan Miller's family, a grinding down of spirit that left behind a permanent ache, a hollow space where a vibrant boy used to be. 1999 had bled into 2000, then into the next decade, each passing year, another layer of dust settling on the cold case files, another anniversary marked by a brief, sorrowful news segment before fading back into obscurity. David Miller, Ethan's father, had passed away 5 years after the disappearance, his heart, his wife always said, simply giving out under the unrelenting strain of not knowing. He had spent those 5 years in a fugue state of obsessive searching, poring over maps, revisiting the monument at all hours, convinced he had missed something, some vital clue overlooked by the authorities. He'd filled notebooks with theories, with diagrams of sightlines, with the names of every registered tourist group in D.C. that fateful April day. His meticulously organized grief became his only companion, a silent testament to a love that refused to surrender to the void. Susan Miller, Ethan's mother, had carried on, a ghost in her own life. She still lived in the same house, Ethan's room preserved as a shrine, his baseball glove on the nightstand, his science fair ribbons pinned to the bulletin board. The silence of that room was a roar in her ears, a constant, deafening reminder of the laughter and energy that had once filled it. She volunteered at a center for missing children, her own tragedy fueling a desperate need to help others navigate the same treacherous waters, though she often wondered if her presence was more a haunting than a help. She had aged, her dark hair now shot through with silver, her once bright eyes clouded with a permanent sorrow that even fleeting moments of respite could not entirely dispel. The Washington Monument, once a symbol of national pride, became for her a towering white tombstone, a place she could neither bear to visit nor entirely avoid in her thoughts. It loomed in her nightmares, a silent, indifferent monolith that had swallowed her son whole. The official investigation had long ago been relegated to a dusty shelf in the cold case unit, a thick binder filled with dead ends, fruitless interviews, and the fading hopes of detectives who had since retired or moved on. Every few years, a new, eager detective might glance at it, perhaps spurred by an anniversary or a training seminar on unsolved disappearances, but the trail was bing cold, the scent gone, the memories of potential witnesses eroded by time. Ethan Miller was a name, a file number, a cautionary tale whispered by parents to their children on school trips. Now, in Clara's small apartment, 2 states away from that monument of sorrow, the past was not just being reawakened, it was screaming. The discovery of the camera, the impossible freshness of the developed film, created a dissonance that was almost physical. It was as if time itself had fractured. Clara spent days staring at photo 27, the eyes in the foliage, the terrified reflection of Ethan. She felt a strange, almost unwilling kinship with Susan Miller, a woman she had never met but whose grief felt palpable through the screen of her computer. How could she, a stranger, be the harbinger of such potentially devastating news? The responsibility was a lead weight. The thrift store, when she revisited it, offered no answers. The manager, a harassed-looking woman with tired eyes, remembered no specific camera donation. "We get boxes of stuff every day, love," she'd said, her voice devoid of curiosity. Could have come from anywhere, anyone. The camera was an orphan, its journey to that shelf a mystery in itself. Had the person who developed the film discarded it immediately, perhaps in a panic, or had it passed through several hands before landing there? The pristinely resealed original packaging nagged at Clara. It felt deliberate. Not a hasty disposal, but something more considered, more chilling. As if someone wanted it to be found, but only after a certain time or by a certain type of person. Someone who understood lost things. You feel it too, don't you? The whisper of the unresolved, the pull of the unseen. Sometimes, you hold an object, and it tells you its story, not in words, but in the cold it leaves on your skin, in the sudden quickening of your pulse. Clara felt it with this camera, a cold, hard knot of dread and a compelling, terrifying urgency. The world outside her window continued its oblivious rhythm, traffic humming, neighbors laughing, the distant wail of a siren, while inside she held a fragment of a nightmare, a key to a locked room that had remained sealed for a quarter of a century. The eyes in the photo seemed to follow her, their pale gaze unwavering. They were not just a clue, they were a presence. And the knowledge that the film had been processed so recently meant that this presence was not relegated to the distant past. It was here, now, breathing the same air. The 25 years of silence felt like a carefully constructed dam, and Clara had just stumbled upon the first critical crack. The pressure building behind it was immense, the weight of unspoken truths, of justice denied, of a childhood stolen. She knew, with a certainty that settled deep in her bones, that she could not simply turn away, could not rebury what had fought so hard to surface. Ethan Miller's story was not over. And somehow, impossibly, she was now a part of it. The question was no longer if she should act, but how, and what demons she might unleash in doing so. The Metadata, film processed, 17 May 2024. This singular, stark fact transformed the camera from a tragic relic into an active, pulsating mystery. Clara, armed with this irrefutable piece of data, felt a shift within herself, from hesitant discoverer to reluctant investigator. The pharmacy receipt, once a flimsy piece of paper, now seemed like a sacred text, its mundane details imbued with profound significance. She returned to the pharmacy, not the one where she'd had the film developed, but the one listed on an almost invisible imprint on the back of the newly developed photos themselves. A tiny logo indicating the original processing lab. It was a long shot, a desperate hope that someone, somewhere, might recall this specific roll of film, this anachronistic disposable camera turning up in the age of smartphones. The lab was a sterile, functional place, part of a larger chain, tucked away in an industrial park. The manager, a man named Henderson with a perpetually skeptical frown, listened to her story with an air of weary patience, his eyes betraying a practiced disbelief honed by years of dealing with customer complaints and odd requests. "Ma'am," he began, his tone flat, "we process thousands of rolls of film a month, even now. Mostly old stuff people find in drawers. Disposable cameras? Not common, but not unheard of." Clara presented the photos, specifically 27, and the receipt with its damning date. "This film," she pressed, her voice steadier than she felt, "was processed here, on May 17th. Can you check your records? Who brought it in? How was it paid for?" Henderson sighed, a gust of resignation. "Privacy policies, ma'am. We can't just give out customer information." But Clara saw a flicker in his eyes as he glanced at the photo of Ethan, at the terror in the reflected lens, at the watching eyes. A flicker of something other than boredom. Perhaps he had children. Perhaps he remembered the headlines from long ago. "This boy," Clara said softly, tapping Ethan's image, "disappeared in 1999. This photo was taken then, but developed last month." Someone knows something. She watched him, letting the silence stretch, the weight of the unspoken hanging heavy in the air-conditioned chill of the office. Finally, Henderson ran a hand over his tired face. "Look," he said, his voice a little less dismissive, "I can't promise anything. But if it was paid for by card, there might be a name. If it was cash, well." He disappeared into a back room, the whir of machinery, a distant hum. Clara waited, her heart thudding a nervous rhythm against her ribs. The minutes crawled by, each one an agony of suspense. What if it was a dead end? What if the trail stopped here, in this anonymous processing lab? He returned, holding a printout. His expression was unreadable. It was an online order, he said, avoiding her gaze. Dropped off in our 24-hour drop box. Paid for by a prepaid debit card. No name, no address linked to the card that we can trace easily. Standard procedure for these anonymous drop-offs if they don't want to create an account. A wave of disappointment washed over Clara. So close. But, Henderson continued, and her head snapped up. The prepaid card was purchased at a convenience store. A quick stop on Elm Street, about 5 miles from here. On May 16th? The day before the film was dropped off. He paused, then added, almost reluctantly, and the drop-off was logged at 3:17 a.m. on May 17th. Odd time to be developing old photos. Elm Street, 3:17 a.m. Small details, perhaps meaningless, but they were something. The prepaid card was a deliberate attempt at anonymity, but the purchase location, the timing, these were cracks in the facade. Someone had gone to some effort to develop this film secretly, yet had been careless enough, or perhaps desperate enough, to use traceable, albeit loosely, methods. Is there security footage? Clara asked, her voice tight with renewed hope. From the Dropbox? Or the convenience store? Henderson shook his head. Dropbox, no. Store? Maybe. But they only keep footage for so long, and without a police warrant, he trailed off, the unspoken clear. He had given her what he could, perhaps more than he should have. The information felt like a fragile thread, easily broken, but it was the only thread she had. The journey from the photo lab to the quick stop on Elm Street was filled with a nervous energy. Elm Street was a tired stretch of road, lined with pawn shops, fast food restaurants, and the occasional struggling small business. The quick stop itself was brightly lit but rundown, its windows plastered with lottery advertisements and faded promotional posters. The night clerk, a young man engrossed in his phone, barely looked up when Clara asked about security footage from a month ago. Police only. He mumbled, waving a dismissive hand. And we overwrite tapes every 2 weeks anyway. Another dead end. Or was it? The prepaid card, the timing, the anonymity. It painted a picture of someone who was hiding, someone who understood the need for untraceable actions, someone who had held on to that camera for 25 years, its terrible secret festering. Why develop it now? Had something changed? Had a conscience, dormant for decades, begun to stir? Or was it something more pragmatic? A need to confirm what the film held before disposing of it permanently? The thought that this person, this watcher, had so recently been active, so close, was deeply unsettling. They weren't a ghost from the past. They were a contemporary threat, a shadow moving just out of sight. The eyes in photo 27 were not just a memory of 1,999. They were the eyes of someone who had walked into a convenience store a month ago, bought a prepaid card, and then, under the cover of darkness, fed a 25-year-old secret into a machine, hoping, perhaps, for an answer or an absolution, or simply to see it one last time before it vanished forever. But it hadn't vanished. It had landed in her hands. And the faint trail, leading from a thrift store to a photo lab to a convenience store on Elm Street, was a challenge she now felt compelled to follow, wherever it might lead, whatever darkness it might uncover. You start to see the patterns, don't you? The small efforts to erase, to obscure, always leaving behind the faintest of traces, like breadcrumbs dropped in a dark forest. The thrift store. It was the origin point of this waking nightmare, the place where the past had physically breached the present. Clara felt an undeniable pull back to its cluttered aisles, a desperate hope that some overlooked detail, some fleeting memory from an employee, might illuminate the camera's journey into her hands. Second chance, the sign proclaimed in faded, cheerful letters, a cruel irony given the camera's grim contents. Inside, the air was thick with the scent of old wool, forgotten perfumes, and the faint, metallic tang of tarnished silver. Mrs. Gable, the manager Clara had spoken to before, was sorting through a new donation of chipped ceramic figurines, her expression one of weary resignation. "Back again, dear?" she asked, not unkindly. "Still thinking about that old camera?" Clara nodded, the plastic casing of Ethan's camera feeling cold and heavy in her bag. "I was hoping," she began, choosing her words carefully, "you might remember anything more about where donations come from. Do people drop them off? Do you do pickups?" Mrs. Fording and Mrs. Proston. 8. Gable sighed, placing a shepherdess with a missing lamb gently onto a shelf. "Most of it's drop-offs. People clearing out houses, you know, attics, basements. Sometimes after a passing." Her eyes flickered with a knowing sadness. "We get a lot of ghosts in here, one way or another." Ghosts. The word hung in the dusty air. Ethan Miller was a ghost, his presence now inextricably linked to this place. Clara described the camera again, the sealed packaging, its vintage. "It would have stood out," she urged. "It wasn't like the usual dusty used items." Mrs. Bilius sized meskertinent. Gable paused, her gaze distant. "Sealed, you said? Like new?" Clara nodded. "That does ring a faint bell. Not the camera itself, mind you, but we had a big donation a while back. Several boxes, mostly new old stock, things still in their original wrappers. End-of-line stuff, looked like it had been in storage for years. Came from one of those clearance warehouses that went bust over near the old industrial park." The old industrial park. The same area as the photo processing lab. A coincidence? Or a connection? "Do you remember when this donation came in?" Clara asked, trying to keep the tremor from her voice. "Or who brought it?" Mrs. Gable tapped her chin. "Let's see. Must have been early May, maybe late April. Big white van, unmarked. Just a couple of fellas, didn't say much. Said it was from a liquidated estate, but the stuff looked more commercial. We didn't ask too many questions. Donations are donations. Early May. That timeline fit. The film was developed May 17th. It was possible the camera had been part of this bulk donation, sat in the thrift store for a week or two, and then been purchased by who? Not Clara, she'd found it later. So someone else bought it, or it was somehow mixed in with other things and she missed it, only for it to be developed by a third party who then, for reasons unknown, discarded it again, sealed, only for it to end up back in a thrift store, or this specific thrift store. That seemed too convoluted. More likely, the person who developed the film was connected to that warehouse donation. Perhaps they worked there, found the camera among the old stock, developed it out of curiosity, and then, horrified or guilt-ridden by what they saw, discarded it in the most anonymous way possible. Back into the stream of unwanted goods, hoping it would simply disappear, or, more chillingly, hoping it would be found. The warehouse, that was the next link in the fragile chain. Clara thanked Mrs. Gable, a new sense of urgency propelling her. The industrial park was a sprawling, desolate area on the outskirts of town, a graveyard of failed businesses and forgotten ambitions. Finding a specific clearance warehouse that went bust felt like searching for a needle in a haystack. She spent the afternoon driving through the grid of potholed roads, past derelict factories with broken windows and graffiti-scarred walls. Most units were shuttered, some with faded "for lease" signs, others simply abandoned to the elements. Then, tucked away at the end of a cul-de-sac, she saw it. A large, anonymous metal building, its paint peeling, a single, rusted sign hanging askew that read "Kestrel Storage, Liquidation." A section of its chain-link fence was bent, allowing easy access. There was no sign of recent activity, yet it didn't feel entirely dead. A single, grimy window high up on one wall seemed to watch her with a vacant stare. This felt like the kind of place where secrets could be stored, where things, and perhaps people, could disappear. Could the camera have been stored here for years, part of some forgotten inventory, only to be recently unearthed when the business finally collapsed? And who were the fellas in the unmarked white van? Were they just day laborers hired to clear the place out, or did they have a more personal connection to its contents? The foliage in photo 27, Clara pulled out the print, her gaze drawn again to those sharp waxy leaves. They looked like rhododendron leaves, or perhaps mountain laurel. Common enough, but in the context of the Washington Monument, it suggested a specific kind of landscaping, perhaps a more secluded, densely planted area. Had Kestrel Storage ever done business in D.C.? Had they cleared out an old property there, perhaps something near the National Mall, and this camera, this single, terrible item, had become lost in the shuffle, only to resurface decades later? The questions multiplied, each one darker than the last. The eyes in the photo. Whose were they? Someone connected to this warehouse, someone who had access to Ethan that day. The thought of those eyes possibly belonging to someone who had worked here, who had handled these discarded items, who had perhaps even driven that white van, sent a fresh wave of revulsion through Clara. She imagined them sifting through boxes, their hands brushing past the sealed camera, oblivious, or perhaps not oblivious at all. The sun was beginning to set, casting long, distorted shadows across the industrial park, making the Kestrel warehouse look even more menacing. Clara felt a prickle of fear, a definite sense of being watched. Was it just her imagination, fueled by the grim nature of her quest, or was there a more tangible presence lurking in the decay? She thought of the 3:17 a.m. drop-off at the photo lab. An odd time for an innocent errand, the time of ghosts and guilty consciences. Whoever developed that film was operating in the shadows, both literally and figuratively. And those shadows seemed to be lengthening, reaching out from the past, their tendrils coiling around this forgotten warehouse, around the thrift store, around the photo lab, and now, around her. The journey of the camera was a descent into a hidden world, a world of lost things and buried secrets, and she was following its trail deeper and deeper into the darkness. The photograph of Ethan Miller, his face a tiny, terrified O in the reflection of an unseen lens, became Clara's constant companion. She carried it with her, tucked into her wallet, a silent reminder of the stakes. The eyes in the foliage, pale and unwavering, haunted her waking hours and infiltrated her dreams. She knew she couldn't keep this to herself any longer. The fragmented clues she had gathered, the recently developed film, the anonymous prepaid card, the possible link to a liquidated warehouse, were too significant, too disturbing to ignore. Yet, the thought of approaching the police filled her with a strange apprehension. Would they believe her? A woman who found an old camera in a thrift store, spinning theories about a 25-year-old cold case. She imagined their skepticism, their polite dismissals. She needed something more, something to bridge the gap between her unsettling discoveries and official action. She decided to contact an investigative journalist, someone who specialized in cold cases, whose reputation was built on a tenacious pursuit of forgotten truths. After days of research, she found him, Marcus Thorne, a semi-retired writer known for his deep dives into unsolved mysteries, his work often giving voice to the voiceless. His articles were meticulously researched, infused with a quiet empathy that resonated with Clara. She composed an email, carefully laying out the sequence of events, the discovery of the camera, the contents of the film, the shock of photo 27, the metadata, the faint trail leading from the photo lab to the convenience store, and the potential connection to Kestrel Storage. She attached a scan of photo 27, the eyes and Ethan's reflected terror, stark even in digital form. She hit send, her heart pounding, a sense of trepidation and fragile hope warring within her. Days passed. The silence from Marcus Thorne was deafening. Clara found herself checking her email obsessively, the lack of response feeding her anxieties. Had he dismissed it as the ramblings of a crank? Had her evidence been too circumstantial, too flimsy? She began to doubt herself, to wonder if she was merely projecting her own disquiet onto a series of unfortunate coincidences. Perhaps the camera's journey was entirely innocent, a string of random events, but then the image of Ethan's face would return, the sheer terror in his eyes, and the conviction would solidify again. This was no coincidence. This was a crime, screaming to be heard. Finally, an email appeared in her inbox. Subject: Re. Ethan Miller camera, from Marcus Thorne. Her breath caught. With trembling fingers, she opened it. It was brief, almost curt. Ms. Hayes, your information is compelling. I am currently out of state on another matter, but I will be back in a week. I would like to meet with you then. Please bring the camera and the original photographs. Do not speak to anyone else about this until we have met. Marcus Thorne. Relief washed over her, so potent it left her weak-kneed. He believed her, or at least he was willing to listen. The instruction not to speak to anyone else added a layer of intrigue, a hint of caution that both sobered and validated her concerns. The week crawled by. Clara felt as if she were living in a state of suspended animation, the world outside her small sphere of discovery moving on, oblivious to the dormant horror she had unearthed. She revisited the area around the Kestrel storage warehouse, not approaching it directly, but observing from a distance. It remained silent, brooding, a monument to decay. She tried to imagine the fellas in the white van, their faces indistinct, their motives unknown. Had one of them found the camera, developed it, and then, overcome by what it revealed, tried to make it disappear again, only for fate, or something more insistent, to guide it to Clara? Or was the connection more sinister? Was Kestrel storage itself, or someone associated with its past, directly linked to Ethan's disappearance? The thought made the hairs on the back of her neck prickle. The day of the meeting arrived, gray and overcast, mirroring Clara's mood. Marcus Thorne had suggested a quiet coffee shop in a neutral part of town. He was older than his author photo suggested, his face lined with the stories he had chased, his eyes sharp and intelligent, missing nothing. He listened intently as Clara recounted her story, his gaze fixed on her, occasionally nodding, his expression unreadable. When she finished, she slid the envelope of photographs across the table, followed by the cheap plastic camera. Thorne picked up photo 27, his eyes lingering on the eyes in the foliage, then on Ethan's reflected terror. He held it for a long time, the silence in the busy coffee shop pressing in on them. The metadata is confirmed? He asked finally, his voice a low rumble. Clara nodded. I have the receipt from the pharmacy where I had it developed, and the original lab's imprint led me to Henderson, who confirmed the May 17th processing date for this specific role. Thorne leaned back, his gaze still on the photograph. 25 years. He murmured, more to himself than to her. Someone held on to this, undeveloped, for 25 years. Why develop it now, and why discard it, sealed, in a thrift store? He looked at Clara, a new intensity in his eyes. You realize, Miss Hayes, that whoever developed this film is almost certainly connected to Ethan Miller's disappearance. They are either the perpetrator, a direct witness, or someone who came into possession of the camera from one of them. Clara swallowed, the stark words hitting home. I know. Thorne then revealed why he had been out of state. He had been in Washington, D.C. following a lead on another cold case, but while there, he had made some preliminary inquiries about the original Ethan Miller investigation. Purely on a hunch after her email. The original case files are sealed, civilian access restricted, he said. But I have a contact, a retired detective who worked the initial disappearance. "I showed him a digital copy of your photo, 27, omitting the reflection for now, just the eyes and the foliage." Clara leaned forward. "And?" "He said the foliage looks like the dense rhododendron thickets in a less trafficked area known as the Boundary Gardens, just north of the main monument grounds. It was searched back in '99, of course, but cursorily. It wasn't considered a prime area. Too dense for a child to wander into easily, too public for an abduction to go unnoticed, or so they thought. The Boundary Gardens, a specific location." Thorne continued. More chillingly, he remembered something, a detail that was never released to the public, deemed too speculative at the time. One of Ethan's classmates, a girl who was known for being somewhat imaginative, claimed she saw a man with pale eyes watching them from the edge of those gardens earlier that day. No one else corroborated it. She was a child, upset. It was dismissed. Pale eyes, like the eyes in the photograph. Clara felt a cold dread seep into her bones. This wasn't just a camera found. It was a direct, terrifying link to a ghost from the past, a ghost who might still be walking free. A ghost whose mistake with an old roll of film was about to bring his carefully constructed world crashing down. The hunt was no longer for the camera's journey, it was for the man with pale eyes. Marcus Thorne, with his network of contacts and his quiet, relentless methodology, began to weave together the disparate threads Clara had uncovered. The Boundary Gardens at the Washington Monument became a focal point. Thorne, using Clara's original photographs and his retired detective contact's memory, managed to get current Parks Department officials to discreetly re-examine the specific rhododendron thickets. While 25 years of growth had altered the landscape, the general topography and plant species remained. They couldn't pinpoint the exact spot of photo 27, not yet, but the location felt chillingly plausible. The man with pale eyes, a detail buried in the supplemental notes of a decades-old police file, suddenly gained terrifying significance. Thorne cross-referenced this with what little information could be gleaned about Kestrel Storage liquidation. The company, it turned out, had indeed been involved in clearing out properties in the D.C. area in the late 90s, including some government surplus contracts and private estates bordering federal parkland. The timeline was loose, the records patchy, but the possibility of a connection, however tenuous, was there. Had an employee of Kestrel, someone working on a D.C. clearance job around April 1999, been the man with pale eyes? Someone who might have encountered Ethan, taken the camera, and then, for a quarter of a century, kept it hidden amongst the company's forgotten inventory. A dark secret buried in a warehouse of unwanted things? The prepaid debit card used to pay for the film development offered another angle. While the card itself was anonymous, Thorne, with his persuasive skills and the implicit threat of future media attention, managed to convince the Quick Stop manager to review what fragmented security footage they still had from mid-May. The quality was poor, grainy, and shot from a high angle. But there, at the timestamp corresponding to the purchase of the prepaid card, was a figure, gender indeterminate at first glance due to a heavy hoodie pulled low and a baseball cap obscuring the face. The person moved with a slight, almost imperceptible limp. They paid in cash quickly, avoiding the clerk's gaze, and exited. Not much to go on, but the limp was a detail. A physical characteristic. Thorne then turned his attention back to the original 1,999 investigation files, specifically lists of park employees, maintenance staff, and even regular known vagrants who frequented the National Mall at the time. He was looking for anyone with pale eyes, anyone who might have had a reason to be in the Boundary Gardens, anyone who might have subsequently dropped off the radar, or, perhaps, found employment with a company like Kestrel. It was a painstaking process, like searching for a single grain of sand on a vast beach. Days turned into weeks. Clara found herself in a strange limbo, her life consumed by this unfolding drama, yet largely a spectator now that Thorne had taken the lead. She met with him regularly, each meeting bringing small incremental updates, or sometimes frustrating dead ends. The weight of Ethan's story, of his mother's unending grief, pressed heavily on her. She often looked at photo 27, at Ethan's tiny, terrified face, and felt an overwhelming urge for justice, for closure. Then came a breakthrough, small but significant. Thorne's retired detective contact, his memory jogged by the renewed focus on the Boundary Gardens and the pale eyes comment, recalled a park maintenance worker from that era. A quiet, solitary man named Alistair Finch. Finch had been responsible for the upkeep of some of the more remote garden areas. He was known for being reclusive, a bit odd. And yes, he had strikingly pale blue, almost gray, eyes. Finch had resigned from his job with the Parks Department a few months after Ethan's disappearance, citing personal reasons. He'd simply vanished from their records. No forwarding address. No further contact. Alistair Finch. The name felt cold, heavy. Thorne began digging into Finch's background. It was difficult. The man seemed to have lived a life on the periphery, leaving few digital or official footprints. But Thorne was persistent. He discovered that Finch, after leaving D.C., had drifted, taking on transient labor jobs. And for a period in the early 2000s, there was a tentative link to a labor hire company that supplied workers to various businesses, including, on occasion, Kestrel storage liquidation. The connection was fragile, almost invisible, but it was there. A man with pale eyes, who worked in the Boundary Gardens in 1999, who resigned shortly after Ethan vanished, and who later had a potential link to the warehouse where the camera might have been stored. And then, the limp. Thorne, searching for any public records related to Alistair Finch, stumbled upon a minor workers' compensation claim filed in 2003. Finch, working for a landscaping company unaffiliated with Kestrel at that time, had injured his left leg in a fall. The injury was described as resulting in a persistent, slight limp. The pieces were falling into place, forming a horrifying, undeniable picture. The man in the quick-stop footage, with the hoodie and the limp. Alistair Finch. Thorne, using an old DMV photo of Finch from the late 90s, a gaunt face, receding hairline, and those chillingly pale eyes, compared it to the grainy convenience store footage. Even with the poor quality and the obscured face, the build, the set of the shoulders, the way he carried himself, it was a probable match. "We need to find Alistair Finch," Thorne said to Clara, his voice grim. "He developed that film. He knows what happened to Ethan Miller." The search for Finch intensified. He was a ghost, adept at living in the shadows. But the prepaid card, the film development, these were recent actions. He was still out there, somewhere, and he had made a mistake. A 25-year-old mistake that was finally catching up with him. You can almost feel the net tightening, can't you? The slow, inexorable pull of consequence. A secret kept for so long, festering in the dark, now dragged blinking into the light, all because of a single forgotten roll of film and the relentless curiosity of a stranger. The past is never truly past. It just waits. The revelation that Alistair Finch, the man with the pale eyes and the limp, was likely the one who developed Ethan Miller's camera film, transformed the investigation from a historical puzzle into an urgent manhunt. Marcus Thorne, using his discreet channels, alerted the cold case unit in D.C., presenting the accumulated evidence, Clara's discovery, the photograph, the metadata, the link to Finch, his past employment at the park, his subsequent resignation, the Kestrel connection, the convenience store footage, and the telltale limp. The official gears, once rusted shut, began to grind slowly into motion, now fueled by tangible leads rather than faded memories. Detective Reynolds, the same officer Thorne had initially consulted, a man nearing retirement himself, but with a bulldog tenacity, took personal charge of the renewed inquiry. He remembered the Miller case vividly, the parents' raw anguish, the frustrating lack of progress. This new information was like a jolt of adrenaline. Finding Finch became the priority. He was no longer just a name in an old file, but a person of intense interest, potentially the key to unlocking a quarter-century-old mystery. They started by tracing the last known addresses and employment records for Finch, sparse as they were. He had lived a life designed to avoid attention, moving frequently, often taking cash-in-hand jobs. The Kestrel storage, liquidation warehouse, now derelict, was searched again, more thoroughly this time. Forensics teams combed through the dusty, decaying offices and storage units. They found little of immediate value related to Finch directly. The place had been cleared out and abandoned for too long. However, in a pile of discarded paperwork in what appeared to be a former manager's office, they found old employee rosters from a temp agency Kestrel had used. Alistair Finch's name was on one, dated from 2002, confirming his temporary employment there. Years after Ethan's disappearance, but establishing a concrete link to the place where the camera might have been stored or discovered among liquidated goods. The convenience store footage, though grainy, was enhanced. While Finch's face remained obscured by the hoodie and cap, the distinctive limp was more apparent. They cross-referenced Finch's old DMV photo with facial recognition software against various databases, hoping for a more recent hit, a digital footprint he might have inadvertently left. Days of intense searching yielded frustratingly little. Finch seemed to have mastered the art of living off the grid. But the prepaid debit card, the one he'd used to pay for the film processing, offered one final slender thread. While purchased with cash, it had been registered online to activate it, a common practice, though often with false details. Thorne and Reynolds focused on the IP address used for that online registration. It was masked, routed through several proxies, but cybercrime specialists began the painstaking work of peeling back the layers. It was a race against time. If Finch knew the authorities were closing in, or if he sensed the net tightening from Thorne's discreet inquiries, he could disappear again, more permanently this time. Clara waited, caught in an agony of suspense. She had set these events in motion with her simple act of curiosity, and now the weight of potential outcomes pressed down on her. What if Finch was never found? What if the truth about Ethan remained just out of reach? She thought of Susan Miller constantly, imagining the renewed torment this investigation must be causing her, a maelstrom of resurrected hope and profound fear. Then, a breakthrough. The IP address used to register the prepaid card was finally traced, not to a fixed location, but to a series of public Wi-Fi hotspots, all within a 10-mile radius of a small, run-down motel on the industrial outskirts of a town 2 states away from Clara, but significantly, in the same state as the Kestrel warehouse and the photo processing lab. Finch hadn't strayed far from the orbit of his past. A surveillance team was dispatched to the Starlight Motel, a place whose faded sign promised a comfort it clearly no longer delivered. They watched, patiently, for 2 days. On the third morning, a man emerged from room 12. He was older, gaunter than his old DMV photo, his hair thinner, but the pale, almost colorless eyes were unmistakable. And, as he walked towards a battered old pickup truck in the parking lot, he moved with a distinct, subtle limp in his left leg. It was Alistair Finch. He was apprehended quietly, without incident, as he was about to get into his truck. He offered no resistance, his face a mask of weary resignation, as if he had been expecting this moment for a very long time. In his motel room they found little: a few worn clothes, some canned food, a well-thumbed book of poetry, and, tucked inside a hollowed-out Bible, a small, faded photograph. It wasn't from Ethan's camera. It was an older, candid shot of a smiling 12-year-old boy with a gap-toothed grin, holding a baseball bat, his red cap askew. It was Ethan Miller, a photo Finch must have taken himself or stolen long ago. A memento, a torment. The arrest of Alistair Finch sent ripples through the quiet communities that remembered Ethan Miller's name. For Susan Miller, the news was a seismic shock, a terrifying lurch closer to a truth she had both craved and dreaded for 25 agonizing years. The man with the pale eyes, the phantom from a child's dismissed testimony, was real. He was in custody, and he held the key to her son's fate. The long silence was about to be broken. Alistair Finch, in the sterile confines of an interrogation room, was a study in defeated stillness. His pale eyes, which had seemed so menacing in the context of a child's fear and a grainy photograph, now merely looked tired, haunted by a lifetime of carrying a terrible secret. Detective Reynolds, his voice calm but unyielding, began to lay out the evidence: the camera, the final photograph with Ethan's terrified reflection, the metadata proving recent development, Finch's presence at the convenience store purchasing the prepaid card, his employment at the park in 1999, his sudden resignation, the link to Kestrel storage, the limp. Finch listened, his gaze fixed on the scarred tabletop, his hands resting limply in his lap. He didn't deny it. He didn't have the energy to. The story, when it finally came, spilled out not in a torrent of confession, but in broken phrases, disjointed memories, a narrative fractured by guilt and the erosion of time. It wasn't a premeditated act of malice, he claimed, his voice a dry whisper. Not at first. On that April day in 1999, he had been working in the Boundary Gardens, tending to the rhododendrons, his usual solitary routine. He saw the school groups, the happy, noisy children. He often watched them, he admitted, from the cover of the dense foliage. Not with ill intent, he insisted, but with a kind of lonely fascination. He had always been an outsider, awkward, unseen. Ethan Miller had wandered away from his group, drawn by a butterfly, Finch remembered, or perhaps just a child's curiosity about the less-trodden path. He'd strayed close to where Finch was working, hidden from the main thoroughfare. Ethan, Finch said, was a bright, friendly boy. He'd asked Finch about the flowers, about his work. He wasn't scared, not then. He even showed Finch his new camera, proudly explaining how it worked. Finch, starved for any kind of human connection, had talked to him, perhaps for too long. He'd felt a strange, possessive attachment to the boy's innocent attention. When Ethan said he had to get back to his class, a panic had seized Finch. He didn't want the boy to leave. He wanted to keep him there, in his quiet, hidden world. He'd grabbed Ethan's arm, perhaps too roughly. Ethan had been startled, then frightened. He tried to pull away. That's when Ethan, in his fear, must have inadvertently snapped that final photograph, 27, capturing Finch's pale eyes through the leaves, and his own terrified reflection in the lens of the camera Finch was now trying to take from him. There was a struggle. Ethan, small but wiry, fought back. He stumbled, Finch claimed, or Finch pushed him. His memory here was conveniently, or perhaps genuinely, hazy. Ethan fell, hitting his head hard on a decorative stone border hidden amongst the undergrowth. He didn't get up. Finch checked him. There was blood. He wasn't breathing. Panic, absolute and overwhelming, consumed Alistair Finch. He hadn't meant to kill him. He hadn't meant for any of this to happen. But now there was a dead child at his feet, a child whose disappearance would spark a massive search. He dragged Ethan's small body deeper into the thicket, to a secluded, disused maintenance shed nearby, almost invisible beneath overgrown ivy. He concealed him there, hastily, inadequately. He took the camera, he didn't know why, a morbid trophy, a piece of evidence he couldn't bring himself to destroy immediately. He fled the park later that day, a changed man, the image of Ethan's lifeless face burned into his mind. He resigned a few months later, unable to bear the constant presence of the monument, the daily reminders of what he had done. The camera stayed with him, undeveloped, a ticking bomb. He moved it from place to place, always hidden, always a source of gnawing dread. Years later, working sporadically at Kestrel Storage, he'd found a secure place to hide it amongst the mountains of forgotten belongings, thinking it would be lost forever if the business ever folded. But when Kestrel did go bust recently, and he was part of the crew clearing it out, he found it again. The camera, still sealed, like a judgment waiting. Curiosity, or perhaps a morbid need to confront his past, compelled him to finally get the film developed. He'd used the anonymous drop-off, the prepaid card, thinking he was being careful. When he saw the photos, particularly 27, the one that showed his own eyes, Ethan's terror, he was horrified anew. He'd meant to destroy everything, but in a moment of panic or strange compulsion, he'd resealed the camera in its original packaging, a detail he couldn't explain. Perhaps a subconscious desire to preserve the evidence of his crime, or a twisted hope it might be found, and his burden ended. He'd then tossed it into a donation bin outside a charity shop, thinking it would vanish into the anonymous churn of unwanted goods. He never imagined it would surface, or that anyone would connect it back to him after all these years. His confession was a meandering, self-pitying account, yet the core facts were undeniable. Ethan Miller's death had been a tragic accident, born of a lonely man's desperate, misguided actions, followed by a cowardly cover-up. Based on Finch's confession, investigators returned to the Boundary Gardens. The old maintenance shed was still there, barely standing, consumed by nature. And inside, buried beneath decades of leaf litter and debris, they found human remains. Dental records, heartbreakingly, confirmed they belonged to Ethan Miller. He had been there all along, just yards from where he was last seen, his final resting place, a forgotten shed, his fate unknown, while his family searched and grieved. The truth, when it finally came, was brutal, senseless, and utterly tragic. There was no intricate plot, no shadowy organization. Just a lonely, disturbed man and a moment of panicked violence that had stolen a child's life and shattered countless others. The man with the pale eyes was not a monster of grand design, but a far more common, and perhaps more chilling figure, a creature of weakness, fear, and profound, devastating error. The news of Ethan Miller's discovery and the mundane, pathetic truth behind his disappearance and death sent a shock-wave of grief and a bitter, hollow sense of closure through all who remembered him. For Susan Miller, it was the end of a 25-year vigil of unknowing, but the beginning of a new, sharper pain, the concrete certainty of her son's fate, the horrifying details of his final moments. There was no relief in knowing, only a deeper, more profound sorrow. The what-ifs that had plagued her for decades were now replaced by the stark, unalterable reality of Alistair Finch's confession. Her son hadn't been taken by some sophisticated predator, nor had he simply wandered off and succumbed to an unavoidable accident in some remote wilderness. He had died, scared, alone, because of a lonely man's inability to cope with rejection, his life extinguished by a panicked shove and a cowardly cover-up. His body left in a forgotten shed mere steps from where his laughter had last echoed. The sheer, senseless banality of it was almost unbearable. Clara Hayes watched the news reports, her heart heavy. She had found the camera, set the events in motion that led to this terrible resolution. She felt no triumph, only a deep, aching sadness. She had sought truth, and truth had been found, but it was a truth coated in tragedy, offering little comfort. Marcus Thorne's final article on the case was a masterpiece of restrained sorrow and quiet fury. He detailed Finch's confession, the discovery of Ethan's remains, and the long, agonizing journey of his family. He also highlighted the series of small chances, of dismissed clues, the classmates' talk of pale eyes, the cursory search of the denser garden areas, that, had they been pursued with more vigor in 1999, might have brought Ethan home, or at least brought his killer to justice much sooner. Alistair Finch was charged with manslaughter and improper disposal of human remains. His trial was a brief, somber affair. He pled guilty, his face impassive, his pale eyes downcast. He offered no further explanation, no apology that could ever be sufficient. He was sentenced to a term in prison that, given his age and failing health, would likely mean he would die incarcerated. Justice, of a sort, had been served. But it felt like a hollow victory. Ethan Miller was still gone. His bright future, his gap-toothed smile, his love for baseball and stamps, all extinguished in a forgotten corner of a national park. A memorial service was held for Ethan, a quarter of a century late. Susan Miller, frail but resolute, stood before a small gathering of old friends, former classmates of Ethan's who were now adults with children of their own, and the detectives, new and retired, who had worked his case. She spoke of her son's vibrant spirit, his kindness, his boundless curiosity. She did not speak of Finch, nor of the anger and bitterness that surely resided within her. Instead, she spoke of memory, of the importance of not forgetting, of the small, bright flame of her son's life that had been so cruelly snuffed out but would continue to burn in the hearts of those who loved him. Clara attended, standing at the back, an anonymous face in the crowd. She had never met Ethan, yet she felt an indelible connection to him, forged through the discovery of his lost camera, his final, terrifying images. As the service concluded, Susan Miller approached her. Thorne must have told her of Clara's role. Mrs. Miller's eyes, though shadowed by an ocean of grief, held a flicker of something that looked like gratitude, or perhaps just weary acknowledgement. "Thank you," she said, her voice soft but firm, "for not letting him be forgotten, for giving him a voice when he had none." She reached out and briefly touched Clara's hand. The contact was fleeting, yet it conveyed a universe of shared sorrow and a fragile human connection. There were no easy answers, no neat resolutions. The discovery of the camera had solved a mystery, yes, but it had also unleashed a fresh wave of pain. Yet, amidst the tragedy, there was also a sense of an ending, however imperfect. The not knowing, that corrosive acid that had eaten away at Susan Miller's life for so long, was finally over. Ethan had been found. His story, in its terrible entirety, was now known. Weeks later, Clara found herself back at the Washington Monument. It was a crisp autumn day, the leaves turning gold and crimson. She walked towards the Boundary Gardens, her steps slow, thoughtful. The rhododendron thickets were dense, their leaves a glossy dark green. She found a spot that looked similar to the one in photo 27, though she knew it wasn't exact. She stood there for a long time, the sounds of the city distant, the weight of history, both national and deeply personal, pressing in on her. She thought of Ethan, his final moments, the terror in his eyes. She thought of Alistair Finch, his lonely, broken life leading to such devastation. And she thought of the camera, that cheap plastic box that had held such a monumental secret for so long, a silent witness that had finally, through a series of improbable chances, found its way to someone who would listen. The wind rustled the leaves, a sound like a sigh or a whisper. There was no true peace here, not yet, but there was a kind of stillness. The cycle of mystery had closed, leaving behind scars, but also a profound understanding of the persistence of truth, the enduring power of memory, and the small, often accidental, acts of courage that can bring light to the darkest of places. Ethan Miller would never be forgotten. His camera had made sure of that, and in the end, that was the only solace to be found.